Neal Ford. Tytuł wykładu to Advanced DSL in Ruby. Proszę o brawa.
Thank you. As you can tell, this is Advanced DSLs in Ruby. I always put this as my first slide, so I won't forget to say this. Ask questions anytime, although I've got a lot of material, so I'll be moving kind of fast through it. You can download the slides if you want from my website, and you can download the samples from GitHub if you want, which is using the Git version control. So what am I going to talk about in this session? I'm going to talk about context and why it's important. I'll keep coming back to this idea of context over and over again when I'm talking about DSLs, because it turns out that's really one of the big deals in DSLs, is supplying context. A little bit about building interfaces, the distinction between the 3 Ps, polishing, pre-processing, and parsing, and a little bit about business natural languages. As I said, I'm going to keep coming back to this over and over again, because this is really one of the reasons that you would want to build a domain-specific language in any language, but particularly in Ruby, is as a way of providing a context. And there's several different ways that you can supply context. And I want to look at 3 different ways to supply context: method chaining, nested methods, and functional specification. And you'll see examples of all those along the way. The other thing I'm going to do as I go along is talk a little bit about patterns of domain-specific languages. Martin Fowler is writing a book on DSLs, and it's going to have a lot of patterns for building domain-specific languages, because we've been doing this long enough now and we understand enough about it so we can start talking about some specific patterns and the way things fit together between different implementations of different kinds of DSLs. And in fact, I'll start with a pattern. I have a couple of anti-patterns as well, but we'll start with a pattern called fluent interface. Fluent interface, the definition is defines a behavior capable of relaying or maintaining the instruction context for a series of method calls. A fluent interface is one that supplies context by some mechanism to make it more fluent than a regular library or API would be. So in fluent interfaces, context is conveyed through either the return value of a called method, self-referential, where the new context is equivalent to the last context, or with a wrapper, either nested or functional specification. And we're going to look at examples of all these guys as we go along. But I need some sort of problem context to talk about this in, and I'm going to do it in the context of the Ruby bakery. So in the Ruby bakery, competition is really tough, because there's a Java bakery right across the street, and they give away free coffee with their bakery stuff, because it's the Java bakery. And so you want to have in your bakery incentives to encourage repeat customers. But the problem is the guys across the street do the exact same thing, because everybody's competing for who's selling day-old bread at their bakery. This is really just an excuse to come up with a very common business context problem. In that you need really flexible business rules, and you need to be able to change them rapidly and deploy them rapidly. And these business rules are frequently not just simple data values, but also algorithmic in nature. So you need some ability to do some simple decisions and those sorts of things. But the number one goal here is easy to define and change, so that you can change them and redefine them very, very easily. So the way that I'm going to do that is by using a combination of 2 DSLs, one for a customer profile. So what I'm going to do is create a customer profile that says, okay, if a customer comes in a certain number of times a month and spends a certain amount of money, that's a certain kind of customer, and then I'll build discount rules based on that customer. And so my profile class, this is an example of a fluent method definition of one of my profiles. A customer who comes in rarely, I'll call that a profile that says that they come in 5 times a month and they spend at least $20. And then the everyday customer is somebody who's a member of our frequent shopper program, and they come in 25 times a month and they spend $500 a month because they really like baked goods, apparently. This is an example of a fluent interface where the context that I'm creating, namely this idea of a customer profile, is carried through each of these subsequent method calls. And they're actually chained together with dots. So these are all just method calls that are made on that customer profile object, and the context is being carried through by the return value of each of these methods. And in fact, this is a specific kind of fluent interface using a pattern called method chaining, where you make modifier methods return the host object so that multiple modifiers can be invoked in a single expression. The goal here is to create a sentence-like structure in code. Rather than have multiple lines of API calls, you want a sentence that reads kind of like a sentence. That's why it's called a fluent interface. And then the return value of each of the methods becomes the caller value of the next method. So let's look at discounts, and here's one way to implement discounts. I'm going to implement this the same way using method chaining. I'm going to say rules.add dot, and it's based on a particular profile, like comes in rarely or every day. And then for membership, you get a 5% discount. For spending, you get a 15% discount. For spending at least $15, you get a 5% discount. And if you come in at least 10 times, you get a 5% discount. So I'm chaining all these guys together and adding those rules. So here's the definition for my customer profile class that I'm using. And the really interesting part of this is this return value for each of these methods, which is self in Ruby, which returns the host object. That's how I can chain them together that way. Each one of these guys, when you call them, they just return self, so you can chain them all together. So that's my profile class. That's actually most of it. I think there are one other thing in there. And here's discount, and you'll notice the exact same pattern here. Each one of the methods that I have on discount returns self so that you can chain all those guys together. And then finally, here's my rule list class. This is basically a class that just keeps track of a set of discount rules. It's a list of discount rules that I'm keeping as an array. And in particular, this add method creates a new discount and adds it to the list, and then prints it out, and then returns it so that I can do some fluent interfacey stuff with it. And so now I can write something that looks like this. This is a unit test to see if all this stuff works correctly. And I create my two profiles at the top, and I have my rules. Rules.add, etc. That's the code you saw before. And this all looks pretty good from a code standpoint, but there's one problem in this example. When I try to run this code, I get empty values when I try to print out all this discount information. All this stuff is empty, and it shouldn't be, and it's because of this. I'm actually writing it out here in the add method that I created in my rule list class. And this is what's trying to write those things out. And I'm getting a problem here, which, as everyone in the Ruby world knows, is shorthand for warning test failed, or maybe something else. So why did this fail? And this all looks pretty good. The reason it failed is because of this line right there. That's when I'm trying to print it out. And the problem is, in this add method, nothing has been populated yet. Because remember the way that this rule list thing is set up, you say rule list.add dot, and then you create the profile and the discount and all that stuff. Well, at this point in time, that discount hasn't been populated. What if, instead of just printing it out here, I were doing something like putting it in a database or something like that? Obviously, I'd be putting an empty record in the database if I did that.